Welcome to Econ Thoughts, the interview series and podcast series of the Society for Professional Economists. Today, we are very pleased and glad to have as a guest Professor Diane Coyle. Diane is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and co-directs the Bennett Institute, where she heads the research under the themes of progress and productivity. She also authored a number of books. The most recent one was Cogs and Monsters, What Economics Is and What It Should Be. And we will be discussing some of the topics from that book and the work she does at the University of Cambridge in our conversation later on. But before we do that, Diane, welcome. And can I also ask you to introduce to our audience by telling a little bit about how you got where you are today and also kind of what you enjoy the most in your day-to-day work at Cambridge?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to take part. I've done lots of jobs as an economist in my career. I started out in the Treasury, UK Treasury. I worked in the private sector forecasting for DRI. I was a journalist, economics editor of The Independent for a long time. I set up a consultancy. I've done lots of public service roles, including being vice chair of the BBC Trust. But for the past decade, I've been an academic, University of Manchester, and now here at Cambridge. One common theme through all of that really has been digital technology. My first book on that came out in 1997, which my students can't believe, was only just the beginning of the internet era. And that still is a core theme for my research today. But as you said in the introduction, I focus on productivity and progress. So what is it that is improving people's lives and living standards? How do we measure that? How do we think about that? And how do we develop policies to improve it?
Thank you, Dan. I think first of all, you're very prescient looking at potentially at digital technology in 1997 when it was just started, but also your point about how to improve kind of people's lives. It reminded me about what economics should be about, because it was obviously the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith kind of birth last year, and then there was a lot of conversation around the concept that Adam Smith has about for flourishing, which is actually how to make people kind of lives better. And I think, and we'll touch later on about how do we measure that and how economics can actually lead into that kind of effort. But before we get that, Diane, you lead the Productivity Institute at the Bennett Institute at the University of Cambridge. Therefore, it's a little bit almost inevitable that the first question is around actually productivity. And there have been a number of kind of recent studies and papers looking at how productivity has moved and has changed, going up and down during the recent kind of COVID cycle, the recent pandemic. Particularly in the US, it spiked up and then it went down, and now it seems to be on the up again. A lot of conversation and discussion around the impact that AI and the launch of ChatGPT might have had actually on productivity going forward. And also, it is very important because it will drive not only economic growth, but also it will affect fiscal policy, but also monetary policy. Just very recently, there was a speech by Isabel Schnabel, who is at the ECB, which looked at the past and says we got a low natural interest rate because of the falling productivity. That's one of the reasons was driving the interest rate lower. But if productivity increases, doesn't mean that it leads to the interest rate higher. So that it has a lot of implication in a lot of different sectors and policy questions. So it will be interesting to explore a little bit where we are today. Are we at the beginning of a cycle, productivity coming back up, or are we going back to where it was pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, and on a relatively kind of low level?
Well, it's a great subject. Productivity is obviously a focus for a lot of academic research at the moment. Here we've got the Productivity Institute, which is based in Manchester, but we are one of the universities involved in that. And the puzzle takes many forms, but the way that I think about it is that we see these extraordinary advances in technology, not just in AI and digital, but also in biomedicine, smart materials, communications technologies. And so the question is, why isn't that translating into productivity growth in the way that previous ways of technology seemed to? And there's a pessimistic view about this, which takes different forms. Robert Gordon famously said, innovations now, nothing like the ones of the early 20th century, so you wouldn't expect them to increase productivity. There's a view that ideas are getting harder to find, that Nick Bloom and his co-authors wrote about. There's a view that actually it's just a natural result of the stage of economic development we've got to in OECD countries, mainly service-dominated, and the Baumol phenomenon means that you're not going to get high productivity growth. And that's Dietz Volrath's recent book. I guess I'm still in camp optimistic rather than pessimistic, but we optimists have to address the question, why isn't the technology delivering productivity growth? Now, this is complicated because there are lots of reasons. There's aging populations in Western economies. There's possibly debt overhang from the financial crisis. We've had multiple economic shocks. So you could think of various reasons for it. And I'm kind of homing in on two in my work. One is that investment has been too low. And without that, you're not going to repeat the kinds of productivity growth we've seen in previous eras, whether that's the 50s and 60s or the 1990s. The UK has had a particularly bad investment performance, and it's across the board. It's private sector, it's manufacturing, and even in sectors that we think we're good at, like financial services or ICT, if you look at investment as a share of that sector's gross value added, so you're accounting for structural shifts, it's lower than other G7 countries. Think about the crumbling infrastructure. So many reasons to think that low investment is one contributory factor, because new technologies have to be embodied through investment. But the other interesting question is, why does it seem that a few firms, the top 5% or so, can increase their productivity using digital tools and the rest can't? And so I think something inside organizations about how do you restructure to enable productive use of new technologies is at the core here. Eric Brynjolfsson in the States has done a lot of work on this previously. And I think it applies to the public sector also, and particularly, and perhaps more so there, because an information technology allows you to make better decisions, increase productivity, if people have got permission to use that information. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing digital translate into higher productivity in many organizations. They just are not restructuring their processes in a way that make use of it and allow people to take decisions productively. There's some interesting case studies about what the effect can be when you do that. Recently with AI, a study looking at a call center in a US company where the use of AI improved the productivity of the least productive workers and raised average productivity as a whole. So if you do the restructuring, you get a big benefit out of it, but it seems quite hard to do that. So I'm interested in looking inside firms and organizations now to understand that better.
No, that's a very interesting point, and that you raise. And it links to a little bit to potentially the increase in inequality, even amongst kind of people and citizens in a sense. So do you see actually that level of superstars firms and potentially superstars kind of people being kind of amplified by AI? Therefore, you will have certain companies and people that are capable actually to use technology, increase their productivity, but then a lot of other firms and a lot of people will fall behind. I think, and I forgot actually who was making the point, that was, well, actually AI might be very good for the middle class, because they can actually achieve the same level of performance as some of the kind of high performing before through AI. So are we going in the direction where we see an increase in inequality, or are we actually seeing where technology might actually help reduce that level of inequality?
I don't think we know yet. So far, it's increased wage dispersion within sectors. And so it is the superstar firms, as they're called, that are paying more. And it's a sort of self-fulfilling phenomenon as well, isn't it? Because they're more productive, they've got better people, and they then increase their market share, and they start to then lobby to sustain their position. And so we've got these very dominant companies in lots of technology markets. But the potential is certainly there for middling workers, as you say, to increase their productivity, if they can figure out labor augmenting ways to use the AI. And I think that is possible. But it's all to play for at the moment. And it'll be shaped both by policy and by the decisions that businesses take about how to use this.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think going to your first of those two final points you made about policy and decisions by companies. On the policy side, what could actually policymakers or institutions do actually to kind of move us towards a path where actually productivity and AI favors kind of a reduction in that dispersion of income and growth, as opposed to actually kind of amplifying? Is there anything in particular that they should be the policymakers or government could do?
Well, there are several things. I mean, one is actually the skill shortage in
Mm-hmm.
AI and the salaries being paid to the computer scientists or the prompt engineers who know how to use the new kinds of AI are phenomenal. So there's, as ever, a skill shortage in ICT skills. There is, I think, something about job quality and the way that shaping the way that companies use the technology. So a bad way to use it would be to monitor employees' keystrokes so that they do their job faster than ever without paying attention to quality or to upskilling them so that they can, you know, make more strategic decisions in the company and so on. The quality of work for lots of people is just becoming quite miserable. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing so many people dropping out of the long-term workforce or reporting mental ill health at work, which is a real epidemic at the moment. So that's another thing. And then the third area is competition policy, where there's a lot of attention being paid to whether new types of AI, generative AI, will either cement the position of the big tech companies or, on the contrary, allow new competition into the market. And again, it's just so early, we don't really know which way that's going to go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the discussion around competition policy and concentration has been quite high. Even recently, by looking at the performance, even on the stock market or the Magnificent Seven, you see a lot of concentration there, and how actually that drives kind of economic growth, but also then that drives and determines policy is going to be important.
Yes.
We mentioned earlier on a little bit about the UK in particular having kind of a bad record recently on infrastructure and therefore looking at how it affects productivity. And recently, we was at one of the events organized by the SPE with NISA, and we're discussing a little bit the UK productivity puzzle. And most people kind of on the panel as well kind of mentioned some of the same points that you mentioned earlier on, though there was one of the panelists was making the point that actually UK didn't perform as bad as people thought. Actually, until actually the mid-2010s, it was very close. It just that he lost a few years there and he hasn't recovered it back. What's your thoughts around the position that where the UK currently is? And if he has fallen in behind, what were the rationale? You mentioned infrastructure, but there might be others. And is there kind of some light at the end of the tunnel? Do we see actually the UK recovering that productivity, or are we kind of stuck in a little bit in a bad cycle at the moment?
I think we're in a bad place at the moment. The performance of the UK before the financial crisis was greatly flattered by the expansion of the financial services sector. The way that's measured includes something called Financial Intermediation Services Indirectly Measured, FISIM, which is an imputed value, which in effect measures risk-taking by the financial sector. And as we know, that didn't turn out so well. So I think that pre-2008 productivity growth is a bit overstated by that. And then we have flatlined since, whereas other G7 countries, many other OECD countries have seen slower productivity growth, but some growth. And so what are we doing particularly badly? Well, one is that our rate of investment is low compared to our peers, as we were just discussing. I think the other is the policy churn. And it's now been well documented, and I've done some work on this, that areas of policy where you're asking companies to take long-term investment decisions, or individuals for that matter, about their education, and government policy changes every year. The number of regional policies, the number of industrial strategies or industrial policies, the frequency of tax changes, the way that education qualifications have been overturned. It's just completely unacceptable, I think, for this policy churn to continue in UK government. So one of the things that the Productivity Institute recommended, written by Mark van Aert and at Manchester and Anna Valera at the LSE, was that there should be some kind of formal statutory body that would be a kind of supply-side OBR that would be able to assess government policies and hopefully provide a kind of longer-term framework for supply-side changes, which take a long time. You've got to sustain that for more than 6 months to have any effect at all.
Yeah. And what will be the one or two kind of tools that the supply side OBR will have actually to make those changes? What would such an institute focus on?
Well, I think a lot of it would be like the OBR or like the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. It would be the fresh air of publicity and just monitoring whether government actually does what it says it's going to do, tracks policy changes, and uses that embarrassment factor, if you like. So just as governments don't want to be seen to be breaching fiscal rules that they feel they have to set with the OBR, they would feel that they wouldn't frequently change corporate taxation because they were going to be held to account for it by a productivity commission of some kind. So we're now one of the only countries that, among our peer group, that doesn't have some kind of institution like this.
Okay. Any good example from other countries that you want to highlight that where they're actually doing this and it seems to have some kind of positive impact?
The one people always point to is the Australian one, which seems to have a positive impact and certainly does a lot of really high quality research. The Dutch have a different model. They've got a body that assesses what the likely impact is of policy proposals from the government, but also from other political parties, so people can make that kind of comparison. But there are different options, and we would obviously want to have some kind of debate about what was right for the UK. But it's kind of UK exceptionalism, like being so centralised, like having such policy churn, that doesn't seem a good place to be.
Yeah, indeed. I think the issue around centralization and too much centralization was also raised at that particular event that I mentioned earlier on as one of the areas which have kind of held back potentially the UK over the past kind of few decades. Going back to the longer term determinants of productivity, a couple of areas or factors that were mentioned by some other authors that I want to get your thoughts on. One of them was a number of people did that, but Charles Jones from Stanford University in particular kind of highlighted was about people. And obviously, productivity is driven by ideas and ideas driven by people. And if you got fewer people, you got fewer chances to get new ideas and so on and so forth. Obviously, looking forward, demographic is going kind of with lower fertility to fewer people, at least in the advanced economies. At the same time, you could say that it's not just people, it's active people. Therefore, if you increase the workforce participation, actually, you could say that you're actually bringing more ideas because you're bringing more people to the market, to say. So in a sense, it's a combination both of number of people, but also people that are active. So what are your thoughts around actually going forward, whether the impact the demographic and labor participation may have actually on productivity? That's one. And the second one, you can pick either of them or both, was around, and it was kind of Edmund Phelps' issue around dynamism and saying that actually our culture actually has become less risk-taking. And therefore, actually, that leads actually to less dynamism, less new ideas coming forward, people taking less risks, becoming more risk-averse, and therefore leading to less ideas and therefore less productivity. Any thoughts around those two kind of different ways actually to look at how productivity might actually going forward?
Well, since the Industrial Revolution, we've never had a period of workforce decline in absolute numbers, I guess. And so we'd be entering unknown territory. It is the workforce that matters, not the population, and there are different ways to increase that. And immigration is another one that we've been using a lot in the UK, and that's a way of focusing on skilled people as well. So that's an option. There is hope for technology. One of the really positive possibilities for generative AI models is that they can speed up scientific discovery. Yeah, and the well-known example is DeepMind's AlphaFold protein folding database. And I know that PhD students are saving themselves years of work by going straight there and using that in their research. And there are other areas of scientific discovery as well. So that might offset a bit the demographic pressures. But the demographic pressures are clearly real. We do a little bit better here in the UK compared to some other countries like Italy or China, where the population decline is going to be quite stark.
Okay, thank you. Now, talking about productivity and impact on growth, then obviously the question a lot of people say, particularly in the environment, current environment, about looking at environmental degradation and climate change is, do we need growth? Or how much growth do we need? Is growth everything that we should care about? And trying to kind of pick a little bit on some of your other topics, and that you explore in the latest books around, is economic growth everything that we should be aiming for? Do we measure in the appropriate way? What is progress? Are there different ways that economists should measure actually how do we kind of look at progress? And if we do so, then what does it mean actually for policymaking, but also for the economics of the profession, kind of any other ways that we should actually explore in terms of the measurement beyond actually what is GDP?
Well, the short answer is we definitely should measure it differently, but we do need growth. So let me start with why we need growth. I think people who argue for degrowth actually misunderstand where economic value added has been coming from for a very long time. And that's the ideas and the intangible aspects of growth. And so, for example, if somebody invented a new vaccine for the next pandemic, that's going to increase GDP. Is that a bad thing? Obviously not. So the ideas, the intangibles are a large part of modern economic growth. Yeah. Having said that, it's got a material base and it needs to be sustainable. And so in our work here at the Bennett Institute, we have been advocating for years, supplementing GDP figures with, in effect, a balance sheet for the economy. Understood really broadly. So as well as produced capital, infrastructure, it includes human capital, obviously, natural capital, and some aspects of social capital as well. How well do we function as a society? And then what we need to look at is sustainable growth, so that you would net off gross domestic product or some gross output measure. You would net off the depreciation in those important assets that enable future prosperity. So this is not wishy-washy. Mm-hmm. I think for some economists, the green agenda does, dip into concepts that are really hard to get your head around. But comprehensive wealth is rooted in the crunchiest kind of economic theory. Mm-hmm. And just as no company would think about having a long-term future without a healthy balance sheet, it's true for the economy as a whole as well.
And how will you measure some of those? You mentioned social capital, human capital. Is there a kind of a way beyond, but some of them you can use proxy indicators as such, and it'll be interesting to know which ones. And there has been a lot of kind of look at using surveys based, whether it's the happiness kind of or life satisfaction, or other way, what kind of metrics will you use, and how will then integrate them with the more material ones, which have historically been kind of income or GDP?
Well, it's a large agenda. So if you take natural capital, which in a way is easier to think about because it's a physical asset largely, then there are physical quantities. You could measure the amount of particulates in the atmosphere. You can measure the amount of green space people can access. You can measure soil quality. And then the challenge is how do you value those in an economic welfare framework? Something we're working on now, but a lot of work needs to be done just to get the physical measures. And what we know from those is that natural capital is deteriorating already. Yeah. So we've got to start on that. Human capital, generally measured using educational qualifications, but increasingly it's recognized human health has to be part of that. Yep. There are a lot of work going on to update how we measure human capital. We're thinking here about cultural assets and social infrastructure. And again, it's probably going to be a question of starting with the physical measures and then thinking about what's the value of that in an economic framework. But it took 20, 30 years to develop our national accounts when the concepts were first invented. And so I'm not really daunted by a multi-decade research agenda. Keep me busy anyway for the rest of my career.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting because having looked at statistics as well and how GDP made, a lot of it is based on surveys to a certain extent, surveys as companies. So when people mention, oh, well, looking at surveys of happiness, well, even for the GDP, there is a lot of survey-based kind of metric at the bottom of it. And as you said, it took a long time to actually develop. So probably if we start at some point, we might have in 10, 20 years, at least something which is internationally recognized. Which kind of lead me to my kind of final question was, obviously you're doing quite a lot of work and there are other kind of institutes and research centers that are doing similar work. The danger is because they all come up with different metrics, different measures, and there is no kind of place, they all come up with different ways, and therefore it's difficult to become recognized internationally, so it's adopted as a kind of new ways to actually measure progress, and in addition to GDP. Is there any effort to try to do something at the international level or to coordinate the various efforts that could lead to something which can be calculated and measured alongside GDP and can be used actually for public and private sector decisions?
You're right to say there's been this sort of proliferation of dashboards, and it's really hard to know what to make of all of these many indicators. And the UN's SDGs are actually a good example of that. There's just lots of stuff in there. So that's why we focused on comprehensive wealth, because it coordinates people around the economic theory that underpins it. So you've got the economics community on board. There is a process of revising the national system of national accounts at the moment that will be internationally recognized, and that incorporates a lot of natural capital measurement. That's quite it's a consensus process, so it's quite low, it's quite cautious, and it might not go as far as people want. But it's a bit like trying to find a technical standard. What voltage do you want for your electricity, or what side of the road are you going to drive on? There's a classic coordination problem there.
Yeah.
So the one I've picked is, let's get people to agree about the theory, and maybe that will help us move forward.
And no, thank you. That's good, and hopefully we'll kind of we'll get there in, as you said, in our lifetimes. But in terms of the data, what does the data show in terms of historically? If you put together a database, and I don't know how many years actually if you had done much analysis going back, kind of years or decades, if kind of average world GDP was at 3%, is the growth, when you take into account all the other kind of element, is it faster or slower than the material GDP? Have you already seen some trends that it can be identified?
Oh, that's a really hard question. Because on the one hand, we've been overstating growth by not taking account of depreciation of natural capital or the infrastructure. And on the other hand, we've been understating GDP because it's very hard to get good measures of new technologies and the benefits they bring. And so in my work on the digital economy, we just have not been capturing quite a lot of what's going on there. So that's a very unsatisfactory answer, because we just don't know. I don't think the slowdown is bogus in any way because of mismeasurement. There are lots of reasons why people's living standards have been, stagnating for a decade and more now. Yeah.
And at the same time, I don't know, maybe I will get a very similar kind of satisfactory answer, but do you think that because of that kind of under measurement, some of the countries are currently kind of, if you look at the various kind of metric like GDP per capita, for example, they don't score particularly well and they score very low. Are they actually, once you take into account all of the other kind of metrics, are they actually performing better? So, for example, if you look at a country like Luxembourg, you could say it's got $100,000 per GDP per capita, and another country might have 15 or 20,000. So there is a disparity which is quite wide. But once you take everything into account, is narrower. Do you see that, or is it still kind of ultimately a lot of the countries that currently scoring quite high on GDP per capita will score quite high on a new metric?
I don't think you change the ranking a huge amount by changing the metrics. But there's a nice paper by Jones and Clino looking at inequality, life expectancy, and leisure. And when you take those into account, the gap between the US and other G7 economies is much reduced.
Okay.
Because you're French, you've got more leisure, you're less unequal, whereas the US has got more GDP, more dollars per capita. So you can make those kinds of comparisons, but really that the rich countries will still be the rich countries, and those broad sweeps, I don't think they change very much.
Okay, no, that's interesting. But at least in a sense, it might point you to different policy that to be able actually to balance that, as opposed to simply say whatever policy that kind of maximizes kind of GDP growth.
Yes, and of course there are absolutely valid choices there about leisure time and inequality.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we'll probably get that paper actually, and we'll put it into the notes on the website as well. I'll make sure that we do that, as well as kind of the links to your institute. But it's been kind of very kind of a wonderful kind of quick scan of where productivity are, and also issues are related to the measurement in terms of how we can measure better kind of economic progress and growth. And I'm glad to hear that you're optimistic. You work on this kind of every day and you spend a lot of time. So if you're optimistic, it also makes everybody else optimistic as well. And in a sense, is something that we definitely need particularly coming out of the last few years of being quite kind of hard and uncertain. So let me kind of, on behalf of all the SPE members and audience as well, thank you, Diane, for the interview today. And again, we might come back for a few more questions and maybe for another session in a few years when we see the impact and we can actually measure a little bit better whether productivity is going in the right direction or not. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.